If you wait until the lock clicks, you are already too late. Most people think wealth is about price. I have never believed that. Price is the part everybody sees. The deeper question is always control. Who has the key? Who writes the rules around the key? Who can change the rules after you have already handed over the asset? That question matters more than yield, more than convenience. And in moments of stress, it matters more than almost anything else. That is why what France just did with its gold matters so much more than the headline number. Between July of 2025 and January of 2026, the Bank of France sold 129 tons of gold that had been sitting in New York, replaced that gold with equivalent reserves bought in Europe, and stored the new bars in Paris. The transaction produced a gain of roughly 12.8 billion euros. It helped swing a deep prior loss into a large profit on the surface. That sounds like a smart trade underneath it. Something much bigger happened. For the first time in roughly a century, France ended up with zero gold in the United States. That is not a trade. That is a message is simple. A reserve is not fully yours if somebody else controls the lock. I want to stay on that image because it explains almost everything. People love to talk about ownership as though ownership is a line on a statement. It is not. Ownership is a legal fact, a political fact, and a practical fact. If your wealth sits behind somebody else's lock, under somebody else's jurisdiction, inside somebody else's emergency powers, then part of what you call ownership is really just an assumption. It may be a comfortable assumption, it may survive for decades, but it is still an assumption. The world has been living on those assumptions for a long time. For decades, New York was not just a city, it was the world's vault. It was the place where countries stored gold because the American system was treated as neutral, permanent, liquid, and trustworthy. If you held reserves there, you were not only storing metal, you were renting credibility from the largest financial empire on earth. The arrangement looked rational: deep markets, easy settlement, familiar institutions, established custody, in calm periods that sounded like efficiency. In reality, it created dependency with elegant packaging. I call that the convenience lock. The convenience lock is what happens when a system becomes so useful that people stop asking who controls it. Convenience is never neutral for very long. Convenience trains the mind to ignore power. When everything works, nobody asks where the spare key is. Nobody asks which court has final authority. Nobody asks what happens if the custodian develops interests that conflict with the depositor. Success makes people lazy in exactly the way danger likes. That is not just true for nations, it is true for families. It is true for businesses, it is true for investors. A person leaves too much cash at a bank they do not understand because it feels easy. A business depends on one supplier because the pricing is attractive. A nation leaves strategic reserves abroad because markets are liquid and transport is expensive. In every case, convenience borrows peace from the future. Then one day the future sends the bill. France did not just avoid that bill. France showed the world how to avoid it while getting paid. Look at the mechanics, because this is where intelligent systems reveal themselves. France did not drag old bars across the Atlantic and spend money melting them down somewhere in a theatrical show of patriotism. It sold bars in the American market that no longer matched modern trading standards, then bought equivalent compliant bars in Europe and put them in Paris. Same gold exposure by weight, better quality for current markets, shorter legal distance to home. The process stretched across 7 months and 26 separate transactions. That is not emotional, that is surgical, and timing mattered. Gold prices had risen sharply, so France was not simply moving metal. It was crystallizing appreciation. The accounting gain was enormous. Yet the real gain was not the 12.8 billion euros. The real gain was that every ounce now sits under French legal control, accessible without American permission. The money was the headline. The key was the story. That is what most people miss when they study finance. They fixate on visible returns and ignore invisible permissions. But invisible permissions become visible all at once when stress arrives. I call that the jurisdiction discount. Whenever an asset sits outside your own legal reach, it deserves a discount in your mind, even if the market refuses to price it that way. Why? Because external custody looks safe until law turns into policy and policy turns into leverage. You may still own the asset on paper, but the route to the asset has acquired politics, and politics never stays cheap. France seems to understand that better than most commentators do. The official explanation for the move was technical. The old bars did not meet modern market standards. Europe had the right trading infrastructure. Paris was a logical location. I do not reject any of that. Technical explanations are often true. The mistake is thinking a technical explanation cancels out a strategic one. Sometimes the technical reason is simply the socially acceptable wrapper around the real motive. The deeper motive was sovereignty. France has a long memory on this subject. Charles de Gaulle understood something many modern leaders prefer not to say out loud. Monetary independence is a very theatrical phrase until your reserves are sitting in somebody else's building. Then it becomes a very literal question. Can I reach what is mine without asking permission from a stronger country whose interests may not match mine tomorrow? That is not paranoia. That is history. In 1933, the United States changed the rules around gold inside its own system. In 1971, the United States changed the rules again in a way that reshaped the global order. When American national interest and prior expectations collide, America behaves like every major power in history. It protects itself first and revises the architecture second. I do not say that as moral criticism. I say it as reality. Strong states do not volunteer to lose optionality. If you understand that, you understand why the old comfort around foreign custody has been weakening for years. Then came the Russian reserve freeze after the invasion of Ukraine. More than $300 billion of central bank assets were immobilized by the West. People can argue all day about the justice or necessity of that decision. I am not here to argue that case. I am here to point out what every finance minister and central banker on earth learned from it. They learned that reserve assets held inside foreign systems are not only financial instruments. They are also geopolitical hostages when conflict escalates. That lesson does not stay inside Moscow. It travels. It travels to Paris, it travels to Berlin, it travels to Rome, it travels to every capital that owns wealth and has to imagine a future where alliances weaken, sanctions expand, domestic emergencies erupt, or rules change on a Friday night after markets close. That is why I call the next mechanism the rule. Change lock, the rule. Change lock is more dangerous than ordinary market risk because it arrives from outside your model. You can hedge price, you can hedge duration, you can hedge currency exposure. It is much harder to hedge a sovereign decision by the custodian state to reinterpret access, freeze movement, impose capital controls, or turn technical compliance into political leverage. In that moment, you discover an ugly truth. What you thought was storage was actually conditional access. And conditional access is not ownership. It is rented confidence. France seems to have decided that rented confidence is no longer good enough. Think about the arithmetic of that decision. France held roughly 24.37 tons of gold worth more than $200 billion. For years, it left a small residual share in New York, around 5%, likely because moving old bars was not worth the hassle and because diplomacy often encourages symbolic gestures. Then an internal audit in 2024 reportedly recommended finishing the job. France executed the plan over the next 7 months. Old bars were monetized at high prices. New bars were acquired in Europe. The remaining American footprint went to zero. That sentence matters. Went to zero. People underestimate what it means when a serious institution takes a residual exposure and reduces it to nothing. Residual exposures often survive for sentimental reasons, for alliance reasons, for image reasons, for reasons nobody wants to challenge because the amount looks small relative to the whole. But the last 5% is often the most revealing 5%. Keeping it says we still want 1 foot inside your system. Removing it says we have finished rethinking the relationship. That is not symbolism at the margin. That is a rewritten risk map. The third mechanism is what I call the sovereignty premium. Most people think sovereignty is abstract. It is not abstract at all. Sovereignty is the premium you earn when your critical assets sit where your own laws, your own institutions, and your own emergency decisions apply first. It is the ability to act without foreign consent. It is the right to solve your own crisis with your own balance sheet. It is the difference between reaching into your own vault and asking another government to open theirs. That premium usually does not show up on quarterly statements. Then one day it shows up everywhere. If a transatlantic dispute intensifies, sovereignty matters. If capital controls appear in a crisis, sovereignty matters. If sanctions regimes expand and legal gray zones widen, sovereignty matters. If domestic politics inside the custodian country turn unstable, sovereignty matters. In quiet years, holding your own key feels old-fashioned. In dangerous years, it feels priceless. France did not merely buy security. France monetized sovereignty. That is why the transaction is so powerful as propaganda for the rest of Europe. Imagine being Germany and watching this unfold. You see a neighboring major state remove all remaining gold from New York, book a giant gain, improve the quality of its bars, strengthen domestic custody, and suffer no punishment. What used to look like a difficult political choice suddenly starts to look like a replicable operating model. One successful exit creates a template, 2 create a pattern, 3 create a migration. I call that the template effect. History is full of systems that look permanent until someone demonstrated the cost of leaving was lower than everyone assumed. The first person to walk away absorbs the anxiety. The second absorbs less. The third turns innovation into convention. Once France showed that reserves can go home, that profits can be booked, and that diplomatic fallout can remain manageable. Every central bank with metal in New York had to rerun its own assumptions. This is where human nature enters. Finance is not just numbers moving through systems. It is status, habit, fear, and imitation. No central banker wants to look reckless. No finance minister wants to be accused of insulting an ally. No institution wants to trigger headlines suggesting distrust. So most people inside these systems wait for social permission. They wait for someone respectable to move first. They wait for a script that sounds technical instead of confrontational. France provided that script. The bars were old, markets were European, logistics were simpler, compliance was modernized, all perfectly reasonable. But behind that language sits the real sentence every serious actor heard: get your national wealth under your own lock before the next stress test arrives. That is not anti-American language. It is anti-dependence language. There is a difference, and mature observers should not confuse the two. I have spent much of my life thinking about incentives. Incentives explain more behavior than ideology ever will. So ask yourself what incentives a custodian state has in a calm world and what incentives it has in a crisis. In a calm world, it wants to look stable, neutral, open, rules-based. In a crisis, it wants to preserve domestic control, strategic leverage, and financial flexibility. Those two versions of the same state are not contradictions. They are phases. The mistake is believing phase 1 guarantees phase 2. That mistake is common because people suffer from what I call the prestige illusion. The prestige illusion is the belief that because an institution is large, famous, sophisticated, and historically central, it is therefore above political stress. It is nonsense, but it is comforting nonsense. Investors worship brand names, countries worship system hubs, human beings outsource thought to reputation, because reputation feels like reduced uncertainty. It is not reduced uncertainty. It is uncertainty with better tailoring. New York gained enormous prestige over the 20th century as the financial center of the world. That prestige was deserved in many respects, but prestige is not a substitute for alignment. A foreign state can be the best custodian in the world and still not be the right custodian for your last line of monetary defense. That last line matters, because gold is not an ordinary asset. Gold is not there to dazzle economists in good times. It is there because systems break, promises bend, currencies cheapen, and power rearranges itself. Gold is the asset you hold because even sophisticated civilizations eventually rediscover the difference between a claim and a thing. That is why the location of gold matters more than the location of many other assets. Gold is supposed to sit beneath a layer of confidence, not inside someone else's confidence structure. If the reserve backstop itself requires external permission, then part of the backstop has already been converted into trust. And trust is exactly what central banks accumulate gold to escape from when the world turns strange. France seems to understand that paradox, the reserve designed for hard times, should not depend on soft assumptions. That is a lesson ordinary people need to hear too, because the same pattern exists at smaller scale all through daily life. Families believe they are diversified because they own financial assets, then discover all of those assets depend on the same system node. Entrepreneurs believe they are independent, then discover one payment processor. One bank relationship, one jurisdiction, or one platform controls access to their own cash flow. Workers believe salary is safety, then discover salary is just one narrow pipe feeding a life with very high fixed obligations. On paper, they have wealth. In practice, they have limited keys. Once you train your mind to see the lock, you start seeing it everywhere. You see it in personal debt. The lender holds the schedule. You see it in labor markets. The employer holds the gate. You see it in digital platforms. The platform holds the audience. You see it in geopolitics. The custodian state holds the vault. Systems look friendly until stress reveals hierarchy. That is why the identity flip in this story matters so much. Weak actors optimize for access. Strong actors optimize for control. That is the shift. A weak saver asks, "Where is the easiest place to park this?" A strong steward asks, "Under what conditions can I still reach this when the temperature rises?" A weak nation asks, "Where is the most prestigious vault?" A strong nation asks, "Whose hand is on the lock?" You can hear the difference immediately. One identity borrows safety from the system. The other identity builds safety against the system. France's move is not just a gold story. It is a public identity shift from participant in the imperial vault to owner of its own final key. And once a country makes that shift, the rest of its logic starts changing too. If your gold belongs under your own jurisdiction, why not deepen your domestic and continental infrastructure around it? Why not strengthen European trading venues? Why not reduce reliance on distant custody? Why not think harder about reserve composition, payment rails, emergency settlement capacity, and strategic autonomy? The metal moving home changes more than the metal. It changes what feels prudent. That is why this event could matter well beyond 129 tons. The source material suggests Germany holds around $142 billion worth of gold, much of it in New York and London. If German policymakers decide current geopolitical conditions make foreign custody riskier than before, then the same modernize and repatriate template becomes tempting. Italy could face the same question. Spain, the Netherlands, and others will not ignore a shift like this forever. It only takes a few serious repatriations before the global story changes from isolated national preference to coordinated decoupling. And when that happens, America loses something. Even if not 1 ounce of gold ever belonged to America in the first place, it loses custodial gravity. That phrase matters. Financial empires are built not only on owning assets, but on hosting them. The host earns influence, information, prestige, and network centrality. Once foreign states stop feeling the need to leave their reserves in your vault, your system remains large but becomes less inevitable. And once inevitability weakens, alternatives stop looking fringe. That is the fourth mechanism. I call it the custodial unwind. A custodial unwind starts slowly. No dramatic speeches, no burning flags, no wild declarations. Just a series of technical decisions that happen to reduce your dependence on a once dominant hub. A portion of metal moves home. A portion of settlement volume moves local. A portion of reserves shifts into different instruments. Each step sounds modest, taken together. They redraw the architecture. Empires rarely lose credibility in one cinematic moment. They lose it through 1,000 administrative choices made by allies who no longer want to be overly exposed to the empire, France's discretionary power. That is what makes France's decision so important. The visible transaction was gold, the invisible transaction was trust, and trust, once repriced, does not easily return to its old multiple. The source document keeps returning to a blunt conclusion. Holding gold in New York is now optional, not obligatory. I agree that this is the sentence that matters. The moment a behavior becomes optional in the minds of elites, history begins to move. The system can survive for a long time afterward. But it no longer occupies the same psychological territory. What used to be the unquestioned default becomes one choice among several markets. Adapt quickly to that kind of mental shift, because money follows permission and permission follows confidence. Let me put the arithmetic and psychology together, because that combination is where real decisions get made. France booked around 12.8 billion euros in gains on the operation. France turned a prior year loss into a large reported profit. France completed 26 transactions over 7 months. France now holds all of its gold at home. France removed the need for American cooperation in accessing the asset. France showed that strategic autonomy can be framed as modernization rather than confrontation. That list is why people will remember this, not because of ideology, because the trade worked. The world copies what works. You see the same thing in investing. One investor survives a crash because he carried low leverage and ample liquidity. And suddenly everyone rediscovers discipline. One business outlasts a downturn because it owned key assets instead of renting everything. And suddenly asset control seems fashionable again. One country secures strategic reserves at home and gets paid along the way. And suddenly sovereignty sounds less like nostalgia and more like intelligent balance. Sheet management. That shift from ridicule to imitation is one of the most powerful forces in capital allocation. But none of this means every reserve should sit only inside national borders, regardless of context. That would be too simplistic. And I do not like simplistic thinking. The real lesson is not isolation. The real lesson is hierarchy. Your most important strategic assets belong closest to your own legal hand. Peripheral assets can tolerate more distance. Core defenses should not. If I were advising a country, I would say this as plainly as possible. Do not outsource the last layer of your security to a jurisdiction whose incentives can diverge from yours during crisis. Use foreign hubs for liquidity. Use alliances for trade. Use global markets for efficiency. But keep your final insurance where your own government can touch it without waiting for another flag to approve the transfer. That is not romantic nationalism, it is risk management. And if I were advising an individual investor, I would translate the exact same principle into a personal operating system. First, separate convenience assets from survival assets in your own mind. Do not treat every dollar the same. Some money exists for transactions, some exist for opportunity, some exist for resilience. If you mix those categories mentally, you will store them carelessly. Second, ask the lock question about everything important. Who controls access? Under what rules? What happens in a freeze, dispute, outage, or emergency? What can be delayed? What can be denied? What can be rehypothecated, restricted, or repriced by someone stronger than you? Third, reduce single-point dependence. The most dangerous form of fragility is when one institution, one employer, one platform, one bank, one jurisdiction, or one political climate can interrupt your access to your own life. Fourth, pay for some inefficiency if it buys you genuine control. People hate friction. They hate redundancy. They hate carrying more liquidity than spreadsheets recommend. They hate keeping optionality because optionality looks idle during normal times. Then abnormal times arrive and all that. Idle optionality turns out to be priceless. Fifth, hold a layer of your life in forms that do not require the entire machinery to remain benevolent. I am not telling you to become theatrical or paranoid. I am telling you to stop confusing smooth access in good times with guaranteed access in bad ones. That is the blueprint hidden inside this gold story. The blueprint is not really about metal. It is about where you place the key to your future. This is where human weakness becomes very expensive. People delay these decisions because the risk feels impolite. They think asking hard questions insults the system. They think building backup signals distrust. They think keeping final control at home looks unsophisticated. They think dependence is harmless because it has not hurt them yet. That mentality can survive a long time in periods of peace, liquidity, and political alignment. Then the environment changes, alliances strain. Domestic populism rises. Fiscal pressure intensifies. Legal discretion expands. Sanctions become fashionable. Emergency powers normalize. At that point, the people who prepared look calm, and the people who optimized only for elegance suddenly sound shocked that the world has become political. The world was always political. You were just being paid not to notice. That sentence sits under almost every financial misunderstanding of the modern era. People thought treasury markets were pure finance until geopolitics entered. People thought reserve custody was pure logistics until sanctions entered. People thought payment systems were neutral plumbing until policy entered. People thought globalization had dissolved hard power, when in truth, it had simply wrapped hard power in interfaces and legal agreements. France is acting as though those interfaces are no longer enough, and I think that is rational, because once a country sees that its strategic asset can sit at home, remain liquid, match modern standards, and still generate a giant gain on the way back, the old emotional argument for foreign custody weakens fast. The old argument was built on a mix of prestige, habit, and convenience. France just attacked all three at once. Prestige lost to self-respect. Habit lost to audit. Convenience lost to control. Those are the real reversals in the story. Let me go even deeper, because there is another lesson here that matters for everyone who wants to build durable wealth. True wealth is not just accumulation. It is accumulation plus refusal power. If your reserves are positioned so that you can be cornered, frozen, forced, or delayed by stronger actors, then your wealth has not yet matured into full power. It may be large, it may be impressive, it may even be productive, but it still contains dependency. Dependency is what mature systems eventually try to price out of themselves. France priced some of it out. The fifth mechanism, then, is what I call the refusal premium. The refusal premium is the value created when you are no longer forced to ask permission at the moment of maximum stress. It is the value of being able to say no because your essential assets remain accessible under your own terms. It is hard to quantify in normal periods, but it is one of the most valuable forms of wealth any person or nation can possess. Countries with refusal power can negotiate differently. Businesses with refusal power can survive differently. Investors with refusal power can allocate differently. Families with refusal power can sleep differently. That premium does not come from optimism. It comes from architecture. The most intelligent architecture often looks slightly inefficient to outsiders because outsiders are measuring visible cost, not hidden resilience. They see duplicated systems, domestic storage, redundant liquidity, lower leverage, more buffers. They call it conservative. Often it is simply well-designed freedom. I have always admired systems that can survive bad weather without begging. That is why the final stretch of this story should not be heard as a narrow debate over gold. Gold is just the cleanest symbol, because it strips the question down to something almost primitive. Here is a hard asset. Where does it sit? Who can touch it? Who can stop you from touching it? Whose law applies when everyone is smiling? And whose law applies when everyone is afraid? Once you ask those questions about gold, you start asking them about everything, and then your life changes. You stop chasing maximum nominal return without studying the access path. You stop confusing statements with sovereignty. You stop assuming large institutions are neutral merely because they are polished. You stop measuring safety by convenience alone. You stop building a future that can be interrupted by one locked door. That is the real psychological reward point in this story. The audience is supposed to feel the shift from depositor to steward, from user of someone else's system to owner of a system that can withstand disappointment. That is exactly the shift people need if they want wealth that survives not just recessions, but rearrangements of power. The source text points toward a larger conclusion that I think is worth saying clearly. America is not collapsing. because one ally moved gold. That would be melodrama. And melodrama is usually lazy thinking, but American financial centrality is being tested by a world that is slowly becoming less willing to confuse alliance with permanent dependence. That is more subtle than collapse and more dangerous than headlines suggest. Subtle erosion is how dominance gets repriced. When allies no longer want their last resort assets inside your legal perimeter, you have not lost everything, but you have lost innocence. The relationship is no longer automatic. It must now compete. And systems that must compete lose some of their old imperial margin. France may not have intended to ring a bell loud enough for the whole world to hear. It did anyway, because everyone understands the symbolism of gold returning home. Everyone understands a nation taking back the key. Everyone understands profit being booked while dependence is reduced. Everyone understands the sentence hidden under the polite explanation, "We would rather face the future from inside our own vault than inside yours." That sentence will echo for years. Maybe Germany moves part of its metal. Maybe Italy follows with a measured percentage. Maybe each decision comes dressed in language about portfolio modernization, trading standards, logistics, or diversification. Fine labels do not matter much once the direction is clear. Direction is what matters. And the direction here is away from unquestioned custodial dependence. That is why the final choice in this story is so sharp. You can keep worshiping convenience until the day convenience becomes a trap. Or you can accept a harder truth. Now, the asset is not the whole asset if the key is elsewhere. You can keep telling yourself that prestige is protection, or you can start building around control. You can keep optimizing your life, your capital, your business, or your nation for smooth participation in large systems. Or you can reserve a layer of your future that remains yours when those systems turn cold. That is the test. Not whether you can accumulate, whether you can still reach what you accumulated when the rules tighten. Not whether your wealth looks large on a screen. Whether your wealth still obeys you when politics enters the room. Not whether the vault is famous, whether the lock answers to you. France just answered that question for itself. It sold the old bars, it bought the new ones, it brought the gold home, it kept the gain, and more importantly, it kept the key. That is why I would not file this away as a technical adjustment or a clever accounting event. I would file it under a much harsher category. I would call it a warning, because once serious actors start bringing hard assets back under their own jurisdiction, they are telling you something about the age we are entering. They are telling you that trust is getting more conditional. They are telling you that prestige is no longer enough. They are telling you that alliances may remain, but blind dependency is fading. They are telling you that control is being repriced upward all over the world. If you ignore that message, you are not being optimistic, you are being late. And late is an expensive way to learn who really holds the lock.